So it's my privilege to turn over this session to Alex, who's leading us through building community through refugee sponsorship. Over to you.
You have your
Oh, there's a good start. I started muted again. So welcome everybody. I hope you had a great morning session. It's wonderful to see some very familiar faces. So our workshop today, my name is Alex. I've been with Aura for about 10 years. I first connected with Aura when I went back to school for social service work, and I simply fell in love with the program. What makes refugee sponsorship special to me is seeing the collective effort of so many people coming together, building relationships, and developing new understandings. And it's that new understandings is what builds communities. I want to apologize right at the start. There's a lot of acronyms. And for some of you who I know have done sponsorship before, a lot of this might not be new information. But because of all of this, I'm going to put it in the chat right now. I put together a workbook, handbook sort of thing that matches the slides, has some of the information. So you'll be able to have a reference afterwards. As Peter said, I will ask, there's sort of 4 sections, and we'll ask for questions at the end of each. But I'm also available afterwards. The acronyms, which is my downfall, please just call me on them because I will. There's a lot of them. So without further ado, let's look at what we're going to look at today. So overall, I want to start with just sort of what is the context? What is going on with the global crisis, the seemingly unending global crisis? What is Canada's response? Mainly, what is the response to sponsorship? Then I want to go to what is community building through sponsorship? What do I mean by this? What are some of the past experiences of previous sponsors? So we have a short video there. And then I want to give you the opportunities. What sort of things can you get involved with right now? So starting off, the big scary number that everyone is familiar with is 80 million people. And what does that mean? The UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which is the UN's branch for all things related refugee, every year around World Refugee Day releases stats. They are always terrible because things are progressively getting worse. And as you can imagine, COVID is not making anything better. So of that 82 million people, we've got about 48 million people who are internally displaced. That means people who have been forced from their homes, but have not fled their countries. You then have roughly about 26 million people who have fled their homes and fled their countries based on a fear of persecution of their race, their religion, nationality, political opinions, being a member of a social group, be that women or LGBT, or they are personally affected by war. You have another roughly 4 million people who are referred to as asylum seekers, which means they too have fled their homes, fled their countries, but where they have arrived, they've not had a determination on what their status is. Most of those people are also refugees. And the UNHCR also wanted to really point out another population that doesn't get a lot of attention, is that there's about 4 million displaced Venezuelans across the country, across the globe. These are people who are not Venezuelan refugees or asylum seekers. These are just 4 million people who have dispersed into neighboring countries, mostly Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. So in total, you've got 82 million people that the UNHCR refers to as the population of concern. Where are some of these big hotspots? Not surprisingly, as most people would be familiar with, Syria remains very high on the list. Venezuela, as I just mentioned. Now, 2.6 million Afghanis was the stat at the time. So now with what's happened over the summer, this is a population that is even of more concern. You also have what happened just last week in Sudan, causing more issues in that part of Africa. And Myanmar, you've got Rohingya refugees. So this is the largest spots, but there are still other populations, and no one population is any more or less important. The media will put attention on certain ones, but it's also really important to remember there's other terrible situations going on that aren't getting attention. Not surprisingly, the UNHCR also wants to point out that of all of the entire 82 million people, almost 40% are hosted in 5 countries. And not surprisingly, those countries are right next to countries that are creating the most refugees. So you have Turkey attached to Syria, you have Colombia attached to Venezuela, Pakistan attached to Afghanistan, and so on. What is interesting is that Germany shows up in the middle of Europe, and that's mainly because of their widely respected, maybe not necessarily understood, but very open policies in trying to help refugees. Where does Canada fit into this? Generally, we've always been in the top 3 of sponsorship countries. With the previous administration in the south, just south of us, you can imagine that changed, and we've become the #1 refugee supporting country that is not directly attached to one of these areas. Now, the biggest issue when you have that scary 82 million people is that what can you do? That is such an enormous problem. Not every person who's been displaced, not every refugee, and certainly not even every asylum seeker will actually go through a program like ours that's called resettlement. So the UNHCR sort of looks at who could be resettled, and that's based on criteria of what is referred to as a durable solution. Can you ever go home? Can you stay where you are? If the answer to those first 2 are no, your only option is resettlement to a 3rd country. And that's, so of that 82 million, they're looking at about 1.5 million people this year will fall into that classification. The sad part about this stat is that you can see this bottom line of the number of spaces available globally for resettlement. So even though there's 1.5 million people who need it, you're looking at less than 200,000 a year. And what turns out is this week was also happened to be our national conference. So a lot of these slides I were able to pull directly from these our international partners, which was very handy for this workshop. But I'm referring to this as the terrible stat of the week. So of those 80 million people who are displaced of some part, there's only 350,000 people have been vaccinated. So you're talking about some of the world's most vulnerable people in the middle of a pandemic, obviously not getting COVID support. Okay, so I think that is the end of sort of the general what's happening. And so that was a lot of stats, and I just want to take a second if anybody has any questions about what is happening right now.
Alex, I have a more general question, perhaps. You used a phrase, a durable solution, and I don't believe I've heard that before. Could you talk a bit more about that or define that for us?
Absolutely. So a durable solution is what the UNHCR decides, what can you do? So what do you have an opportunity to live your life to the fullest? And where can you do that? And they either say, do you have an opportunity to go back to your home country? Can you stay where you are? And if the answer to those 2 questions is no, then the only durable solution would be going to a new country, a 3rd country.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Thanks so very much.
Can I jump in? Alex? Thanks. Are Tibetans a part of this number?
Sorry, say that again?
Are Tibetans a part of this refugee number?
It would depend where they are. The problem is they would not, if Tibetans are in Tibet, which is not recognized by China, probably not, because they wouldn't get there'd be no way for the UN to give them the distinction. But they certainly would be considered, if they've left, they'd fall somewhere in there.
Even if they're in India, for example?
If they're in India and if they've crossed the border and they have a certificate, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments at this time?
And if something comes up later about just the general situation, you can always ask then too. I just want to me, I didn't want to really wait to the end in case something, you had a burning question at the start and I'm like, well, now I don't care because we've talked about 10 other things. So
Actually, I appreciate that with all the acronyms.
So moving on, we're going to take a look at, what is Canada's response? what does Canada do about this terrible situation? And in particular for refugees, there's two main ways refugees can come to Canada. They can completely on their own arrive in Canada and make a claim. And that's, we refer to it as, the proper name is protection inside of Canada, but it's inland claimant. So that means somebody who's somehow got here and gets to a border and says, you know, I want to declare asylum, I'm a refugee. There's another branch that we certainly at ORA deal with, you know, primarily, is resettled refugees. Those are people who have made some arrangement before coming to Canada, being part of a program. And there's two main programs, either the government or privately sponsored. So GAR, government assisted refugees, there are no private sponsors involved. The RAP, which is resettlement assistance program, is basically social assistance rates. So the government somewhere has decided this person should come. They get here, they have support they have very modest financial support, and they would rely on settlement agencies to fulfill their settlement. The branch that we deal with and I want to talk to today are privately sponsored refugees. To make it more complicated, there's of course 3 different branches of privately sponsored refugees. Group of 5, which are any 5 Canadians getting together to do this work. Community sponsors, which are various organizations who apply directly to the IRCC, which is Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada, or the immigration branch of the government. Or sponsorship agreement holders, which ORA, along with the Diocese of Toronto, is one. And from that, there's of course more levels of bureaucracy. There can be the most common case, which is name cases, which is somebody from a group, a church, a parish saying, I know this person and we want to bring them here. So there's that we refer to as a name case, or there is another program that is hopefully reopening very soon called BVOR, which is Blended Visa Office Referred, where you have the overseas piece and a case pre-built by the government. They also offer some financial support. And because those pieces are in place, these cases actually come much sooner. So what are the goals of the PSR program? As Peter asked earlier, the point is a durable solution. People need to have an opportunity to live their lives. And what does a durable solution in Canada look like? As sponsors, you're working together to provide a safe and caring support system. You're supporting informed decision-making. You're not making decisions for people. I don't know about you, but I really don't enjoy being told what to do, especially with my life, with my money, with my family. But I do appreciate being given information so I can make informed choices. The key part of being a sponsor is you're going to use your Canadian experience to recognize and ensure sponsored people, refugee newcomers, have access to the services they should have access to. And this is the key idea. You're promoting independency and self-sufficiency. You don't want to create a situation where the newcomers rely on you to literally do everything. You're trying to help them in that first year to get acclimated to Canada, understand what it is, help them really help and support that first year, but make sure they're working towards being able to live their lives here on their own. My colleague likes to always refer to it as that extra help for that first year. So you might also be asking what's happening with sponsors, with arrivals right now with COVID. So IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration, takes care of all travel of refugees across Canada, to Canada, but to all other countries as well. So they are the authority for statistics. Roughly the GARs, the government assisted, they're supposed to be about 13,000 a year. For PSR, or privately sponsored refugees, they're looking at between 22 and 25 are the targets. As you can see, all of last year, instead of roughly 35, there was 8,000. This year, they're at the end of this month, they're sort of looking at almost 13,000. So we are thankful there's been some movement, but in situations where people have been delayed for decades already, it's even more so, and we're looking at about a 70,000 person backlog by the time the end of the year happens. So you can imagine a slow process. People who have been involved in sponsorship already, I can see you nodding your heads, you already know how slow it can be sometimes, and this is just going to make it slower. So who is Aura and how do we fit into sponsorship? So Aura is a Canadian charitable organization, and our mission is to assist sponsors, support, assisting in the sponsorship and resettlement of refugees. I screwed up our own mission statement. Sorry, Stan. I've got a board member here who's going to be shaking his head in a second. So what are we responsible for? So in all those things, what do we do? And we can sort of look at, ultimately, Aura takes responsibility for everything. That is our job. We are supposed to interact between government, the diocese, our constituent groups, who are the sponsors, and the newcomers themselves. You can also break down those responsibilities into two main timeframes, if you like. There's pre-arrival, so we're working to make sure IRCC's regulations are followed. We're assessing sponsors and approving their capacity to do a sponsorship. We're working with the diocese to make sure their regulations are followed. We're building the applications and we're submitting them. Once the application is submitted, as we just sort of alluded to, there is a lot of time. But once somebody arrives, we are still also responsible for monitoring the progress of the sponsorship. We're needing to make sure that both the newcomers are receiving adequate support, but so are the sponsors, making sure the sponsors are feeling supported as they go through the sponsorship. We do this through check-ins, meetings. You know, we try to be as available as possible. And throughout the entire thing, the post-arrival, we're providing information, support, and advice. You might ask then, what are sponsors' responsibilities? Now, this page, I can tell you right now, is normally a 2-hour training. So I will very briefly go through what sponsors have to do. Again, I'm going to look at the pre-arrival. You're going to develop a settlement plan. This is the plan that you're going to use to ensure settlement works. You're looking at financial concerns, housing concerns, health concerns, education concerns. How are people going to adjust to the community? And again, most importantly, how are you going to create at the end of the sponsorship that people are moving towards self-sufficiency? Once the arrival happens, which can take many months to sometimes years, you're going to carry out that settlement plan. So you can imagine, as you're waiting for 1 to 2 years in a named case, this might change. So having a committed group who are willing to put the time and effort not only at the beginning, but also to make sure to update and be ready for an arrival is a really key part of being a good sponsor. You're going to be there to help navigate systems, identify opportunities, again, advocate when needed. You don't need to do everything, but if somebody is nervous about making a phone call, you sit with them, let them make the call, but be there with them to support them. And one of the most important things, it's going to be emotional. Making a major change to a new country, but very likely a completely different climate, a very different political system, and worrying about family who aren't as lucky to have moved, that is where you're going to be spending a lot of your time. And unfortunately, the bottom line is, what is this going to cost? And this is a key factor in deciding if people can do sponsorship or not. And again, this table is in the document I sent the link out to, so you don't have to write down the numbers, but it's not cheap. And think about what it's like to, what would it cost to suddenly support someone living in Toronto for a year? And you can see even at a single adult, it is based on social assistance rates. You don't want to provide so much money that once your support stops, they can't support themselves reasonably. There's also a difference between the middle column and the last column, in the sense that before we can even submit a case, we have to have a certain amount of money that satisfies the government and the diocese that you're going to be able to carry out the sponsorship in a responsible way. But it is going to cost more than that. Now, again, these are going to be 3 really detailed slides, and I apologize for that. But I do think it's important to sort of make sure everybody understands what are the stages of doing settlement, of doing a sponsorship, and how long it really does take. So before anything happens, we call this the steps to submission. So first, a group has to identify themselves to us that they want to do sponsorship. We have to make sure that we have capacity to take in the case. We have to make sure the diocese is comfortable with the group. We have to make sure the leadership of the church is also on board. The second stage, where you've just seen how much it costs, you have to fundraise. You have to make sure that set amount is in place. There's extensive work developing a case it's generally between my colleague Marin and the newcomers. Sponsors have to provide full contact information to anybody who's going to be involved with the group to us and get a current police check. The third, so once all of those have happened, we're talking, several months have gone by. The application gets finalized. We again have to have confirmation of funds. We have to have confirmation from group leadership, and then we have to submit it to the government. That once it gets submitted, what happens? First, it goes to Ottawa. Ottawa does a relatively quick check. It's more basically seeing, is this complete? Have you put in all the pieces? The application gets sent overseas, which it will get looked at between many months to several years, depending on the visa post. When it does get looked at, they generally contact us with questions. What about this? What about this? Or if it's been a couple of years, please update all this stuff, which is great. We finally heard something. Oh, by the way, redo everything you did 2 years ago. So it can be very frustrating. If everything's in place, they set up an interview. If the interview is successful, they then do a medical check. They then do a security check. That everything goes through positively with that. Visas are issued. Once the visa is issued, we generally know, so we can inform the group that something is happening. And that way we can then get ready for welcoming people to Canada. And then what we just talked about, all those responsibilities of the group, this is now your first year. All that time and effort you put into developing the settlement plan now becomes action. How are you going to make sure all those things that you planned so well for before can still happen? With the idea that you're always pushing towards helping people become as self-sufficient as possible. So I will stop there again for questions. So that's sort of the very macro look at all the things it takes to become a sponsor who has responsibilities and sort of the process of what sponsorship looks like. So if anybody has any questions there, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Sue, I see you have a question.
Yeah, Alex, there's been so much. Thanks. There's been so much in the news about Canada's lack of effort in the Afghan situation. I wondered if you'd like to comment on that. I'll leave it at that.
I will be polite and agree in general that there is a lack of grassroots effort in sponsorship. One of the last options the last sections we talk about is a little bit what information I do have about the Afghan situation. But having COVID, having an election called right in the middle of Afghanistan really imploding, and has really slowed things. I know for a fact that people had things in place that they were trying to develop. I mean, the government moves slow at the best of times. It's just the reality. You add COVID, you add an election, it goes a lot slower. They have done, and to be fair to everybody, no one had a clue that Afghanistan was going to implode like they did. The military hardware and stuff that was in place, people thought they had capacity to stand up to the Taliban. But if there isn't a will to do that, if there isn't a desire for a people in a country to do that, that just doesn't happen. And you saw what happened. Afghanis wanted out. They wanted nothing to do with the Taliban. They've had decades of living under that rule. They had no desire to try to combat that. And no one, the government, the UNHCR, our government, all governments, no one had a clue what was going to happen. And they've scrambled, and they have done, there's sort of two policies that they've announced. And one is trying to get people out who were already directly helping Canada, which to me, I think should have been done a lot sooner, but at least they got onto it at the end. The second one is actually activating things like sponsors, helping Afghanis come out. And again, it's so slow. Week after week, I keep getting told, okay, this is going to be, we're going to be told what the program is. This is how you're going to access it. And it goes on and on and on. It was only this week that we've heard that there's going to be 3,000 spaces. So I didn't really go through this, but every year for named cases, there's an amount of allocations that we can use. And there's a cap so that we have access to. Every SAW is limited by this. These special spaces will be beyond that cap and will be hopefully used to expedite Afghanis in particular situations. And literally, that's what I know. And that hasn't been announced. And now waiting for a new minister is slowing everything down yet again. So I can tell you we get between 10 and 15,000 requests a year for sponsorship on our phones, on our email every year. Since July, beginning of July, and what was happening, it exploded with the desire, with the need. I mean, it's not that Afghanistan hasn't been a problem before. You had 3 million people who needed help. It has been heartbreaking listening to people what's happening. And the worst part is people who are in Afghanistan right now think they can access this program. You can't. If you haven't left Afghanistan, you're not a refugee. You're an internally displaced person. It means you don't have access to any of this stuff. So it's heartbreaking, Sue.
Can I just carry on with that slightly? And not that I know, but the media is portraying Canada as lagging far behind other countries. And I don't know if that is just the fact that we went through an election and the new immigration minister and so on. And you probably don't want to comment on that, but it just seems worrisome to me.
It is worrisome. I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that we're further behind than other people. There's a capacity issue of what can be done from our military. Like the Americans can roll up billions of dollars worth of military hardware and pull people out. They didn't do that till the very end either. And so Canada was, left to do what we could do. Do I think we should have done more? Yes. Does the government think they should have done more? I think the answer is yes. But Afghanistan is not an easy situation. Like none of these situations are easy, but Afghanistan in particular is a boondoggle at best for the last 70 years. I mean, the problems in Afghanistan are not just the Taliban. I mean, it is, I want to say mess, and it's not fair to Afghanis but it is a constant disaster of humanitarian misery. And has been for a long time, and unfortunately will continue that way. Peter?
Thanks. Yeah, I want to ask a bit about some of the groups that collaborate to support refugees, and I wonder if you can share from your experience, what are some of the problems that they face, or sort of the common interruptions in that very complicated flowchart of everything that has to happen?
Can I actually delay that for the next section, because I sort of go through some of the main issues people face. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Thank you for anticipating me.
Yep. We'll go on then to what I, in a very macro way again, is sort of looking at community building through sponsorship. Why I like sponsorship. This is one of those things that, as a person who wasn't super affiliated with organized religion coming into it, versus getting into this as still a relatively young man, and having seen really what the best of what church is the community building. So of course, sponsorship helps newcomers. It gives people a second chance, a new chance to live their lives. And that is obviously the primary drive for most people who get involved in sponsorship. Also is really important to sponsors themselves. Being part of someone's new beginning, refugee sponsors share an incredible journey that enriches and develops their own lives. They often develop lifelong connections with families, with fellow sponsors, and gives them an understanding of their community. The welcoming parish or community group who is bringing the family, they also develop it's amazing what happens. Congregations are often introduced to refugee newcomer families. They get an introduction to different cultures and different religious backgrounds. And this helps develop understanding and foster an appreciation of differences. I think that is the main part that has always attracted me to it. You get people who are, for a lack of a better word, ignorant of other people, and they make assumptions. And then all of a sudden they meet someone who's been sponsored, and they suddenly realize they care about their kids, they care about their families, they want to live, they want to work hard, they want to be free to do what they want to do. And it reminds you how lucky you are to have been born in Canada and have these opportunities that so many people don't ever have. Lastly, the community itself, you get to see the sponsors start learning about the community. They start seeing the strengths, they start seeing the possibilities. The parish also sees that, but also more, I think even more importantly, they start to gain a better appreciation of some of the weaknesses, some of the struggles faced by marginalized communities. This is what I'm alluding to for Peter, is that there's barriers to accessing programs. There's barriers to starting that life. And the lack of programming that does exist in certain parts. And sponsors, like the cool thing about sponsors, you're using that Canadian experience to make some of these things better. And overall, you start seeing the greater community, seeing what I said at the start, now the best aspects of church life, of church people in churches in general who do a sponsorship through us are, you are showing that the church cares, and it's not just words. The church is more than the building. It is going out and doing things. It's making a difference. It's making a difference to the lives of the newcomers, to the sponsors themselves, and the greater community. And directly for what Peter was asking about, like, what are some of the major issues? So our board recently had a presentation from it's RSTP, which is the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. And they've sort of distilled some of the challenge, like the main systemic barriers faced by newcomers. Some of them are not super surprising, right? Language. Language is, rightfully or wrongfully, you have to speak English or French in this country if you're going to get ahead. And that first year of sponsorship, that is the newcomer's main job. There are programs in place that you have to be able to encourage people to access them. So many people come here like, I'm so thankful for this opportunity, I just want to work. And I get that. But this is that first time, and finding work and meaningful work is equally important, just from a self-value point of view, but you have to take this time to find English. The sad part is not all English programs are the same. They don't necessarily meet people's needs for jobs. It is a problem. And it leads to the second one, low employment. How can you possibly, if you have a very basic understanding of English, or perhaps you're not even literate in your home country's language, let alone English, how are you going to get work? Housing, doesn't matter if you're a newcomer or not. Housing in this part of the world is extremely difficult, extremely expensive. Getting into school, and to me, it's more the second one. It's recognizing credentials. We want to move away from, refugees need help. Obviously, you wouldn't be a refugee if something catastrophic hadn't happened. But it doesn't mean refugees aren't skilled. They don't have their own personal experiences and expertise in their own areas. And unfortunately, though, when you come to Canada, we have a system of credentials. And each institution has a right to protect themselves. But there's got to be a better way of recognizing foreign credentials in some capacity. And then the other one is waiting time. And as complicated as things are, as long as it takes to get cases done, it's hard for people here. They're talking about, sponsor groups falling apart, but think about how hard it is also if you're overseas, knowing there's a group who's willing to help you, and you see that opportunity and you can't access it. So that this speaks more to the mental strain that you're going to face as well. Peter, did that give you a better understanding of what you were hoping for?
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense to me.
Okay, now what I would like to do is share a video. We're still good on time. Let's see if I somehow screwed up Zoom. No, I completely lost him. Stop that. There we go. Sure, advance video.
Where we see humans in need, it is our duty to respond. As a people of faith, it's our duty to respond. They're waiting for us to respond to their need. And that's really the one thing that I would say to any parish, that there is a family waiting across the ocean for you to sponsor and support them.
Anglican-United Refugee Alliance. We just say AURA, and we within parish ministries are not always mindful that there's a small dedicated staff team in Alex and Marin that really do the bulk of this work, as well as a board and a series of volunteers that have really devoted their spare time, their energy to creating a structure that allows the church to just pick up and run. And so one of the gifts that we have as a diocese and as our Anglican church in this area is this refugee partnership program.
I'll see if my memory is serving me right. I think it's Teresa Avila whose essential quote is saying, you know, we are the arms of Christ, right? The love of Christ is going to come through our mouth. Our arms are going to be the ones that do the deeds. And instead of throwing money at an issue, and we did throw money at an issue. However, way more than that, we threw hearts and boots and hands and actually did the work.
So I would say to anybody trying to start at square one, you're not too small. The church is not too small. You have a wider community to draw on, and there is a lot of value in that. Don't be intimidated. It's going to be an emotional roller coaster. As I said, it's like missional work on steroids. You're happy 1 minute and you're crying the next. You're frustrated 1 minute and then everything falls into place. It's a roller coaster, but it's amazing results.
This effort of sponsoring refugees caused our better selves to kick in. And Christchurch Deer Park raised an enormous amount of money. In fact, we were able to sponsor a second family because we had raised more than we needed for the first family. It was simply a wonderful, wonderful experience for the community. And what I have found is that people do not want to stop. Bringing in one family, supporting one family was not enough. They're saying, you know, I have read in the paper, I know that there are now 80 million displaced people in the world. How do we do this? How do we continue?
Are we blessed? Have we gotten to a point where we're being nudged, or where someone has knocked on our door and there's an opportunity for us to more deeply live our faith? And so it's that sense of the resources are in place, the spirit is willing, the need is there. Communities just need to really, prepare and make the mental adjustment of moving into a new family way as a faith community. Are we going to embrace this? Can we be relational? And if we're at a point where we're seeing a need and thinking we're going to solve a problem with the money we can raise, or to just bring people here, I would just encourage a little nuance to the plan to really make sure that the interested parties are open to committing to a relationship, and also building some flexibility into their plans, that they can be adaptive, responsive, and that way just allow God's blessing to work through these new families as they bring their gifts to our communities.
I think the big thing was, though it was a huge amount of work, it was a wonderful character defining experience for Holy Trinity.
Yes.
So, and if you ask Holy Trinity to tell a story about herself, the church will, with pride and joy, talk about the ministry with the Duku family.
Yeah.
And I would say when you're coming out of a refugee camp like Kakuma, and I'm going to speak very broadly intentionally, it would not be surprising to find some issues around physical or mental health coming out of that trauma. And Holy Trinity's ministry in some ways could perhaps have been life-saving.
So, I mean, I think it's important to hear, other than me say it's wonderful. It's important to understand that it is a lot of work, a tremendous amount of work, but it is rewarding. But you have an opportunity to truly make a difference to yourself, your community, and to people who don't have another option. So I've completely lost the Zoom controls, but this is the end of that, the community sort of building section. And I'd be happy to take any questions or thoughts about how it may have affected you already, being a sponsor.
Thanks so much, Alex. Are you having technical issues?
I've minimized something and I can't. I think I might have found it back. I can.
Okay.
It's just finding the little windows. I've got a lot of windows open.
Right now, at least we can hear you and hopefully see you as well. So yeah, folks have questions. Now is a great time for that.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question in the chat from Deborah Solomon. Have you ever had a sponsorship breakdown after arrival? That's a great question.
There are, with a breakdown, there's sort of two kinds. There's fault and no fault. And if you have a fault breakdown, that means something the organization has done. The government will investigate and you will lose your agreement. That will affect not only the sponsorship that's happening, but it will affect all sponsorships under the umbrella of ORA. So I can very proudly say, no, we've never had a fault breakdown. A no fault breakdown, which means that something has happened outside of the control of the sponsors or the organization, yes, they do happen. And it's 99% of the time people move. And so if in order to hold the sponsorship together, the government, it's referred to as, there's a blanking on the correct phrasing, but you have to make sure that the sponsors are in the same community as the newcomers. So when somebody lands in Toronto and then tells you, by the way, I've got a mother in Vancouver, bye, obviously it's our responsibility to try to find another sponsor in Vancouver, which, it's hard to do when there's no previous connection. And but you still have to make the effort. You still try to, you have to support them until a decision is made by the government. Generally, we've had, I want to say 3. I can think of 3 since I've been here where something similar to that has happened. And the government issues a no fault breakdown, which means it does not affect you at all. It doesn't affect the organization at all. But they certainly do happen.
Thanks for that. What are some other questions that have come up during the presentation? I'd be curious to know how many of the people on the call currently have already engaged in this type of sponsorship, or if this is something that they're considering.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I can see at least 8 on my screen who are definitely sponsors, and several of whom who have sponsored many, many times. So it's wonderful seeing them.
That is good to know. And I see a note from Sherry Cameron. All Saints Kingsway has sponsored 2 families. We were very fortunate. Both families are doing very well now. So that's good to hear. And here you are coming back for more.
But it is what happens once you get in and you realize what a difference it is. It's pretty hard to say no the next time when someone says, "Can you do it again?" But I would say that it doesn't show up on that systemic barriers issue, but the biggest issue for groups is burnout. It is a lot of work. Anybody who's done anything like this knows that this is at times a 24/7 commitment. And people come and you think it's going to be great. And Stan's quote in the video, it is a roller coaster. There are times when this is the greatest thing in the world. There are times like, oh my goodness, why did I do this? This is terrible. You suddenly find out there's some terrible trauma that has happened to these people. It is a lot. So trying to manage multiple sponsorships over multiple years. I know there's several people from the cathedral who are doing multiple sponsorships from multiple populations for multiple years. It is difficult to do that and to keep groups together to manage that.
I mean, I note that one of your key themes here is that, refugee sponsorship is a way of building community. So I can imagine how that happens within a church. Do you have some good examples, or perhaps do others have good examples of ways that they have maintained and built a community through doing this? What are some of the practices that people have followed to do that and to ensure that there's that ongoing support?
It's one of those big questions, and I know people are thinking, but it's communication is always key. It's making sure you have that core group. It's making sure you're talking to each other, not just about the sponsorship, but checking in on how they're doing. It is really, really hard when you care about other people and someone asks, "Help me," to say no. I sound very cold and jaded at times because I have to say no every day, multiple times. It is horrible saying no. But you also have to look at your own capacity. Because if you get into this and you start it and it all falls apart, it's even worse. That sense of false hope, and then it is extremely difficult. And I find one of the biggest ones, it's referred to it as an echo effect. So you bring a family here, the sponsorship goes well, and not surprisingly, that family has other people who want to come. And how do you say no to that? Or how do you figure out how can you possibly do this? You've just spent a year with the post-arrival and possibly years before building up to it. And you're like, how in the world are we going to do this again? And that is a reality. You have to be able to look at yourselves and say, do we have the capacity for this? It is a hard question. I do hope that the biggest problem we have is finding people who are willing to engage in this work. And me coming out and telling everybody how hard it is and how slow it is and how long it is and how expensive it is not a huge sales point. It's not like, oh boy, everybody, let's just get on board. This is so easy. It's not easy, but it is important. It is a really important work. This program we used to call it uniquely Canadian. It's not anymore, because the attention private sponsorship received globally because of the Syrian crisis, I want to say 26 to 27 other countries now have similar programs. The Americans just announced a similar program. They've always brought in the most people, but it's that GAR level, the government level. They don't have that grassroots, people can get involved, and they're going to change that. There's a lot of value into it. It's less economic, there's less economic strain on the government. It's also, there's research that shows that sponsorships are better, that outcomes are better when you have support. It's not rocket science. If you come to a country and you have people here who are willing to help you through the system, you're going to integrate better. You're going to connect better. I it's rosy and I get called Pollyanna for it, but to me, sponsors are the pinnacle of what being Canadian is to me. It's recognizing that you have a good country and that you're willing to put your time and effort and money on the line to help someone else who doesn't have that opportunity. That's like the best part of Canada to me. I don't look at it, but I'm a first generation Canadian. My dad came when he was 13 from Germany. Right. So everyone assumes, like, but till the day my grandmother passed away, she never thought she fit in because she had an accent. Right. And it's different. My brother and my father and my grandmother look a lot different. We haven't, again, I don't look at it, but there's an Arabic side to my family. So my experience in Canada is very different than my brother's. Right. So you don't have to look very far to find, people being treated differently because they look different or sound different. But you can, instead of feeling guilty about that, you put your privilege to good use, help people. And not just help newcomers, but help people understand that maybe they can look at life in a different way. Maybe their ignorance is not necessarily, they're just people.
Well, I'll definitely agree with you that when I came to Canada about 10 years ago, it made a whole difference to have people here who I was connected with through what became my faith community. So yeah, that's absolutely the case for me too in my life. Elaine, did you have a question?
I did, thank you. Alex, if you could just briefly explain it, because I'm part of a constituent group through Aura. I fully understand that branch of it, I think. But the difference between, say, a community sponsor and a group of 5.
So I'm not an
Criteria.
expert. Okay, I'll tell you right now, I'm not an expert at either one, but I can,
Okay.
what a group of 5 is any 5 Canadians can get together, fill out the paperwork and submit an application. The success rate of that is incredibly low. The government has, even though the program exists, and I, again, probably shouldn't be saying this because it's being recorded, but the program exists, it does not follow through because the government really doesn't have a lot of faith in the program, in people being necessarily honest and able to do it. That's why when you have a sponsor and you have a group of Canadians willing to do it, because generally a group of 5s are relatively newcomers getting together to try to bring other family members. The applications aren't filled out. I mean, if any of you have worked on an application, you will know how detailed and complicated it is. If you're not used to filling them out, it's really easy to fill them out incorrectly. And the government doesn't care. They want it right. It's either right or get sent back. And generally it gets sent back and is told, go work with a SAW. That's what happens to most of them. The community sponsorship, I don't actually know that much about it, because I mean, you'd think the distinction should be, is a SAW not a community sponsor? And I know a large national SAW took a lot of liberties at the beginning of the Syrian crisis to submit a lot of things as a community sponsor, even though they were a SAW. And the government has really shut down that loophole very tightly. So that community sponsor is it's sort of like a SAW, but it's not, because it has its own regulations. And I wish I could tell you more about what those regulations are. And the other thing with a SAW, those other 2 groups, the people have to have UNHCR designation, which means they have to have a certificate issued by UNHCR in the 3rd country saying that you are a refugee. SAWs have a little bit more leeway in being able to develop a case, saying you don't necessarily have to have that certificate in certain situations, which is a slight difference as well.
Elaine, did that?
Thank you. But just to elaborate on that last point, so a constituent group and through the SAW, the individual or family does not necessarily need to have the UNHCR
in certain situations. Yep.
In some cases. Great, thank you very much.
There's a question in the chat from Stan. Alex, could you talk a bit about the giving back by some of the refugees sponsored by the diocese?
It is remarkable how sponsored people want to give back. That opportunity that you're giving them, they don't want to just take, they want to give, they want to be part of the community. And we actually have one in particular who came through the Orno sponsorship. His name is Ahmed, who's working as a chef, and when he's not working as a chef, he is fishing. But every year we have something called the Ride for Refuge, and that's one of our major fundraisers. And so teams get put together, we either bike, I think it's bike 10 kilometers or walk 5 kilometers. But anyways, this is the 3rd year in a row Ahmed has created his own team. So he's not just looking to give back to Canada, he's actually looking to give back to Aura and everything that he's been able to receive through us. So I mean, and so many times you hear stories about refugee newcomers, you know, even if their religion is different, they still participate in the church in some way. They find ways to support fundraising events, they find ways to support the community members. It's more about often building lifelong friendships, what happens. And there's a stat, I'm going to screw it up because I don't know how up to date it is, but it used to take newcomers to Canada something like 14 years to be invited to a dinner to someone, a native Canadian's house for a meal, versus sponsored newcomers it's within a week. Outside of COVID and 2 weeks of quarantine, it's awfully quick. You're in someone else's house for dinner and other things. It's a really different thing. And you get, I mean, no one on this call would be on this call if they felt this way, but there's some people who sort of think, you know, let's take care of our own first before we take care of other people. And they fail to understand how many social services exist to take care of people here in Canada, and just the level of what people overseas don't have. It's stark. And so when people are given that opportunity to just say, look, here's a chance to be yourself and take advantage of what Canada has to offer, it's the give back is remarkable. No one does it for that give back, but you see how happy people are. And so many times I'm so glad that my kids don't have to deal with what I had to deal with. So often it's that people will do whatever they can to make sure their kids have a better life, a better opportunity.
Well, thank you for that.
I know we're quickly running out of time, but I would quickly like to just go through some of the, we've already touched on some of this, but I would like to just sort of go through opportunities that do exist.
Please.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the BVOR program. This, several people in here would have actually done sponsorships through this. So it's blended visa office referred, meaning that some visa officer overseas has linked up with somebody from UNHCR. They've decided this case is in particular need. So these cases, they used to like to say 50-50 split in the funding. We all knew that was never true. So now it's that there's financial support, partial funding is and so it's sort of based on it is based on social assistance rates, and that there's 6 months that they'll map that social assistance rates. That's not enough to cover everything, but it's a big chunk of money. Because all the casework has already been done, they arrive sooner, generally between 2 and 4 months. And it really is the opportunity to welcome the stranger, because generally people who come through BVOR don't have advocates here saying, please help this family. That doesn't mean sometimes you find out that there are family members here. And it might be a little hard to see, but sometimes this is literally the profile we get. So there's very basic, almost no information on what this family is. And so when you're trying to match a family on paper to a group, it is really difficult. Sometimes these sponsorships are fantastic, and families, everybody connects, but everybody is different. You can't say everybody from one population is going to be matched with somebody else. I mean, I have neighbors I like, I have neighbors I don't like. I mean, it's tricky. This program has unfortunately been closed since the onset of COVID, but they are really hopeful by late this year or very early next year, it will be open again. And we're anticipating, I think that it's roughly 1,000 people a year. I'm assuming this is where a lot of Afghani families are going to come from. At least that's my hope. There's the problem with Afghanistan, and that is the next section, is that you already had 2.5 million Afghanis displaced. So how do you now then decide which Afghanis get served first? The people who've been most affected most recently, or people who've been living in Pakistan in a camp for the last 5 years? Like, I mean, it's tricky. And so what the government has sort of decided that they're looking at is populations. Who is at most, okay, work that up. So the first policy, which is happening now, and I actually know several people in this call who have already been supporting people who have been just lifted into Canada, and generally land in Toronto, they get dispersed to other communities, and they're not sponsor organizations aren't supporting them, but other organizations are helping make sure people have clothing and food and support that way. The second policy, which is still very, 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 very slowly being announced, is originally there was about 20,000 people, Trudeau upped it to about 40,000 people. And the idea is that this program is going to be like regular sponsorship, except it is looking at particular people. So vulnerable groups, including women leaders, human rights advocates, LGBTI individuals, journalists, and their immediate family members. So you've got this huge population of 2.6 million people, and you've got this new population who's going to be displaced or is in the process of being displaced. But unless you fall into one of those categories, you're not going to be able to access even this program as we know it right now. So we've been assured that the 3,000 expedited spaces are going to be hopefully by, well, they said November, and that's obviously Monday. So I'd be shocked if I suddenly had an email that this is working by Monday, but they're going to try. But I mean, I don't think they've really thought everything through. And I think the other problem is, as awful as Afghanistan is, there are so many other populations that are equally terrible. And we don't know what's going to happen in Ethiopia and Eritrea. We don't know what's going to happen in Venezuela. We don't know. So it's every time you do something like this for a major population, other populations get forgotten about. And you've got generational, you have refugee camps in Africa that are generational, where people have lived their lives, had children, those children have had children, and those children are now having children in a refugee camp, and they don't get any attention. And they're in just as much need as other people. So how you pick who needs help when everybody needs help is a challenge. Other ways for people to get involved, other than directly through a named or a BVOR sponsorship, we've just launched this year the Diocesan Refugee Network, which meets monthly, and I can see several people on this call who are part of that already. But it gives people an opportunity, sponsors, to get together and talk about things. And as we have more people arriving, I think that will be even more helpful. We've just launched a Slack channel, which is a way to get directly involved. Because sometimes maybe you're not ready to form a sponsorship group. Maybe you just want to see, can I help out a group here? Who's doing what in my area? And again, this is brand new. I'll put all the links in the chat. They're also in the thing you can download. But we really have hope for that, because I mean, Aura, we've got 2 full-time staff members. We've got an active board who's really supportive, but we don't know what every group is doing at every moment of every day. We just can't. And so we've been trying to find ways for that. So maybe you have I've got an extra table and chair. Does anybody need it? You can post something like that there. Is there a church or a group in my area who needs help with something? Maybe I can help. Maybe you need a help driver. Maybe you need someone to take people to appointments. That's sort of what we're hoping to achieve there. And maybe you can find partnership. Maybe your parish isn't big enough to do a sponsorship, but maybe there's somebody nearby who's also looking, and maybe together you can form a partnership to do a sponsorship. You can sign up for the newsletter, which comes out quarterly, and we'll keep you up to date with what we're doing and how you can be involved. You can also request somebody from Aura to come speak at your church, at your group, and we can tailor it to whatever would work for you. Is your group thinking about sponsorship? Are you need that push, to encouragement? Is it whatever? We're here to help. And on that line is that you're not alone through this. I mean, I'm sure at times it does feel lonely, because it's you, and generally there will be one person in the group who is leading everything, and then you have the next level. But we're here, we have a handbook that's online. We can also give it to you physically. There's the website, which has the sponsorship toolbox section that has so much information on everything that's in the training, everything that we've come up with, new, if you want group training, like activities you can do with your group to keep motivated, that's all in there. So that's always the website. You can call us or you can email us. I mean, I put mine in there, but you could also put in Marin or info or admin. It all comes to Marin and I, we will take care of it. And I think if we have time, I just want to do one little last video.
Well, Alex, thank you so much. I guess on behalf of all of us for sharing your wisdom and your insights and your passion for this work of changing lives. Just from my own reflections, it's not always possible for us to do things about the systems of power that impoverish people and imperil them. But you've shown us how it's possible for us to use our own power and privilege and our personal resources as community. So thank you for your encouragement to do that and for pointing us to some of the many resources that Aura has made to identify the different barriers that are out there and to help us find a way through it. And I also want to thank everyone else on this call, some of those who you've identified who are involved in this work. It's a big inspiration to me as well. Are there any last thoughts you would like to leave us with as we close this space?
I really appreciate everybody taking the time on a Saturday afternoon to listen to this. And again, for some of you, I'm sure it was not a lot of new information, but without you, we don't have sponsorship. You make the difference, and it really can be an amazing transformational program. And without you, it doesn't happen.